Imagine waking up to a seemingly ordinary day with a nagging headache. You reach for a familiar bottle of Tylenol, trusting it will bring you relief just as it has countless times before. After all, millions of Americans use the over-the-counter medication every day to help ease their pain. But what if, instead of easing your pain, the familiar medication became a lethal threat? In the early 1980s, this grim nightmare became a reality for several unsuspecting victims. The Tylenol Murders, a series of poisonings that brought terror to households across the US, has become one of the most infamous and haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. Not only a story of crime, but also a tale of a nation grappling with vulnerability, a company racing against time to save its reputation, and an enduring quest for justice that still remains unfilled. Join us as we delve into a mystery so dark and perplexing the stain it left behind can still be seen today, decades later. This is the story of the Tylenol Murders. On September 29, 1982, in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up feeling under the weather. Her parents, hoping to relieve her symptoms, gave her one extra-strength Tylenol capsule. Little did they know, within hours, their lives would be changed forever. By 7 a.m., Mary was dead. Later that same day, in Arlington Heights, Illinois, a postal worker named Adam Janus collapsed unexpectedly. He was then rushed to the hospital, but tragically did not survive. Grieving and in shock, Adam's brother and sister-in-law returned to his home and, seeking some relief from their grief, took Tylenol from the same bottle Adam had used. Both of them also fell ill and subsequently died. As the days went on, more mysterious deaths occurred, all linked to the same over-the-counter medication. Authorities quickly realized they weren't just dealing with several tragic coincidences, but in fact, something far more sinister. The situation demanded an immediate and robust response. And so, the FBI, the FDA, and local police forces launched one of the most intensive investigations in history. Early on in the investigation, it was discovered that the Tylenol capsules in these cases were laced with potassium cyanide, a deadly poison. And in total, 7 people died from the poisoned Tylenol, all in the Chicago metropolitan area. Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol, faced a crisis of unprecedented scale. Despite seeming to have no involvement in the tampering itself, the company took swift action to protect the public. They issued a nationwide recall of all Tylenol products, amounting to about 31 million bottles, and offered to replace them with new tamper-proof packaging. This move would cost the company over $100 million, but it was a crucial step in regaining public trust and ensuring safety. In addition to the recall, Johnson & Johnson launched a massive PR campaign to inform the public about the danger and what steps they were taking to mitigate it. They set up hotlines, distributed warnings through the media, and cooperated fully with law enforcement to help in the investigation. Despite these extensive efforts from all parties, though, the investigation faced numerous challenges. The tampering itself appeared to be random and without a clear motive, making it difficult to track down the perpetrator. In addition, there were no fingerprints left behind, no witnesses, and no clear suspects, all of which left investigators with more questions than answers. However, even with the odds stacked against them, investigators were still able to uncover some key findings. One of the first breakthroughs in the case came from the discovery that the poison bottles had only been found in stores around the Chicago area. This meant that the tampering was most likely done after the bottles had left the manufacturing plant, ruling out the possibility of a widespread manufacturing defect. This allowed investigators to start looking into suspects around the Chicago area who could have been responsible. From that, 2 lead suspects emerged, each with an interesting story and a solid case against them. The first I'd like to cover, though, is a man named Roger Arnold. Arnold became a suspect after being reported by the owner of a bar he frequented named Marty Sinclair. You see, Sinclair had heard from some regulars at the bar that Arnold, not long ago, came into possession of a large amount of cyanide, and with Arnold recently acting increasingly erratic after some troubles in his personal life, he seemed like the perfect suspect when the killings began. So, investigators took the tip and started looking into him. Eventually, police would search his apartment, finding laboratory equipment, multiple guns, and books on poisonings and explosives, including a copy of the book The Poor Man's James Bond. This book contained instructions specifically on how to make potassium cyanide, which, in addition to the lab equipment found, made for a pretty sinister look. Although no cyanide was found in the search itself, Arnold told police he had previously had some in his home. In addition, it was also found that Arnold's wife was receiving treatment at a hospital across the street from one of the stores that sold the laced Tylenol, meaning he had the access. However, outside of that, there wasn't much more evidence against him. He refused to take a lie detector test when asked, and without any further evidence, authorities had to drop the case against him. Arnold's story doesn't end there though, as 7 months later, he would be sentenced to 30 years in prison for shooting and killing a man at a Chicago bar. You see, Arnold was attempting to get revenge on the person who tipped off the police about him in the Tylenol case, the previously mentioned bar owner, Marty Sinclair. However, he mistakenly shot someone else who he thought was Sinclair. This of course raised some suspicion on Arnold being responsible for the Tylenol murders again. But nevertheless, even if that were true, Arnold took that secret to his grave, as he continued to claim his innocence in the Tylenol case until his death in prison in 2008. The other suspect police were tailing has also been the lead suspect in the case for decades, a man by the name James William Lewis, and his story is a little different. Lewis was initially brought to investigators' attention shortly after the killing started, when he sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop them. Lewis was then arrested after the letter was traced back to him and admitted to writing it. However, he claimed to not have any involvement in the actual poisonings. Despite this fact though, he told authorities during interrogations how someone might have gone about the killings, like by buying Tylenol off store shelves, adding poison to them, and then returning them back to stores. This was later found to be the most likely way the culprit went about it. In addition, investigators eventually found a notebook on poisons in his previous home. Lewis's fingerprints were on many of the pages of the book, including one about cyanide and its lethal dosage in humans. All in all, Lewis seemed like the perfect suspect for the case. Someone who's knowledgeable on cyanide, knew how to go about the attacks, and even wrote a ransom note demanding money to stop the poisonings. However, even with all this, one thing was still missing: hard evidence. Simply put, investigators couldn't find any physical evidence linking him directly to the crime. On top of that, there was even some evidence that went against Lewis being the one behind the poisonings. Like how investigators were never actually able to prove Lewis was in Chicago at the time the bottles were laced, as he had moved from Chicago to New York a couple weeks prior. And so, Lewis only ended up being charged with extortion for writing the letter, and served 13 years for it. His involvement in the case didn't end there though. In 2007, over 25 years after the poisonings, investigators made a shocking discovery. With all the advancements in technology by this time, detectives took another look at the ransom note Lewis sent to Johnson & Johnson. Upon doing so, they realized that while the letter was received by the company on October 5, 1982, it had a hidden postmark with the date of October 1, 1982. Although this might seem completely normal at first glance, with the news about the laced Tylenol being released to the public the previous day, it was anything but. You see, when Lewis was initially arrested and interrogated in 1982, he claimed that he had spent 3 days writing the letter before sending it. If true, this would mean that when he started writing the letter, the public was not yet aware of the laced Tylenol's existence. Lewis was confronted about this discrepancy in a 2007 hidden camera operation. After confirming the 3-day wait period it took to write the letter, investigators showed him how that timeline would mean he wrote the letter before the news on the laced Tylenol was made public. Lewis responded by saying that while he has been telling himself for 25 years that he spent 3 days writing the letter, he now realizes that that would be impossible. As the Chicago Tribune pointed out though, this made for another issue in Lewis's case. In 1983, during discussions for his case on the extortion letter, he told detectives that he first learned about the laced Tylenol from a New York Times article. Strangely enough though, the first time the New York Times covered the case was on October 1st, meaning that Lewis had less than a day to learn about the topic, research it, write the letter, and send it to Tylenol's headquarters. When he was confronted about this discrepancy, Lewis just blamed faulty memory. Eventually, though, investigators had gathered enough evidence to get a search warrant, which took place on February 4th, 2009. And while there were some questionable things found, like a note that said, quote, "Yes, I am the killer, but I got 10 good reasons," most of it could be explained by the novel Lewis was working on at the time. A year later, in 2010, Lewis agreed to submit DNA samples to the police, claiming that he had nothing to hide. Sure enough, his DNA did not match the DNA found in recovered bottles. Almost 30 years after the killings, and investigators still didn't have enough evidence to charge him. And they never would. Lewis maintained his innocence regarding the poisonings all the way until his death in July of 2023. Around the same time Lewis submitted his DNA test, Arnold's body was exhumed to test his DNA as well, which also did not match the DNA in recovered bottles. And so, we're left without enough evidence to conclusively rule out or confirm either of the lead suspects, with it even seeming completely possible that neither one of them were involved. Even if one was, with neither of them being alive anymore, we may never know. So, where does that leave the investigation? Well, even today, there isn't a conclusive answer. That doesn't mean that investigators and the public haven't been working to find one though. Many have been looking into it and researching it for decades to try and solve the mystery. So let's take a look at some of the leading theories that have been proposed over the years. One of the most interesting theories, and the one that I'd like to start off with, is the corporate sabotage theory. The theory suggests that the bottles of Tylenol were intentionally laced to try and damage Johnson & Johnson's image. At first, it sounds pretty outlandish, and while it is pretty out there as far as theories go, there's some pretty solid reasoning behind it. To start off, it's important to know that at the time of the attacks, Tylenol was the leading over-the-counter pain medication, accounting for a substantial amount of Johnson & Johnson's revenue. If the goal of the attacks was to hurt the Tylenol brand, and in turn Johnson & Johnson, they sure did a good job. The media swarm that came after the poisonings made national news for weeks, plunged consumer confidence in Tylenol, and cost the company tens of millions of dollars. Additionally, many believe that the precision and timing required to lace all the bottles across many locations so fast is evidence of the attack being a coordinated team effort rather than a lone actor. All this, combined with the fact that a new type of pain relievers known as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs were just starting to make their way onto the market, led many to question the motive behind the attacks. Perhaps a competitor was looking for a fast way to knock Tylenol off the pedestal as the leader in the industry, right before their product would hit the market themselves. Of course, this is all just a theory, and there's no hard evidence that has surfaced to confirm any part of it. It does, however, explain many aspects of the case that are still lacking an answer, and so it's gained a lot of popularity over the years. Another theory that revolves around financial gain is that the murders were done as an attempt to extort money out of Johnson & Johnson, similar to what Lewis tried. But if this was the case, there were no other financial demands made, making this theory unlikely to be the answer. Of course, there's always the possibility that one individual is behind the poisonings, whether it be Lewis, Arnold, or more likely, someone else entirely for any number of reasons. As far as those reasons go, many have been proposed, ranging from a disgruntled employee or insider at Johnson & Johnson to it being a random act of violence from a serial killer. Some even believe Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, was the one behind the poisonings, as he spent much of his life around the Chicago area. Another individual that some theorists have pointed to was a woman named Lori Dan. Dan was also in the Chicago area around the time of the Tylenol poisonings, and would later go on to attempt to poison many children she babysat for and others. She failed in this attempt due to the poison being heavily diluted, and would go on to take her own life shortly after. Other than her similar crimes and location though, there really isn't anything linking her to the poisonings. In addition, Dan's criminal activity didn't seem to start until after her marriage fell out in 1985, 3 years after the poisonings took place. As for the disgruntled employee or company insider theory, it mainly gained popularity because it answers the mystery of a possible motive, something that was really missing in the case overall. In addition, it was also found that some of the bottles of laced Tylenol came from the same distribution center, with some even being from the same lot itself, meaning that one individual could possibly have been responsible for lacing the bottles before they even hit store shelves. While none of these theories paint a complete picture or solve the mystery alone, with the two main suspects seemingly not being involved, they are all we have for now. There are of course some other fringe theories as well, like the attacks being part of a terrorist attack or the work of organized crime, but for the most part, they seem even less likely. But while the answer to who's behind the Tylenol murders remains elusive, its impact does not. In response to the tragedy, the US Congress passed the Tylenol bill in 1983, making it a federal offense to tamper with consumer products. The FDA also started working on regulations, which eventually led to tamper-proof packaging being required for all OTC medications. Before the incident, tamper-proof packaging didn't really exist, but by 1989, it became a requirement. The case today is still unsolved and lacking a solid lead, though despite this fact and the decades that have passed, law enforcement haven't given up on their investigation. Advancements in forensics and technology are constantly offering hope for uncovering clues that were previously overlooked. The key to solving the mystery could be as simple as taking another look at a piece of evidence, or as complex as a new piece of technology offering more details. Regardless of where a clue might be hiding though, it seems that for law enforcement and the families of the victims, there is always still hope that one day the mystery will be solved. Thanks for watching. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed watching, it would mean the world to me if you would consider subscribing, liking the video, or leaving a comment, as it truly helps a smaller channel like mine. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.